There was a time when questioning religion came with serious consequences: social rejection, exile, even death. But that world is rapidly fading, and something new is taking shape in its place. A shift that has been quiet, gradual, and almost invisible in plain sight. Until now. We live in a world where belief used to be the default, but increasingly, it's no longer assumed. Not because someone loudly proclaimed a new truth, but because more and more people stopped pretending they believed the old ones. What we're seeing today isn't just disbelief. It's not a rebellion or a movement in the traditional sense. It's a slow unraveling, a quiet exit from centuries of inherited certainty, and for many, it feels less like a loss and more like stepping into fresh air. At the center of this change is something we don't often associate with philosophy or faith: the internet. A place built for commerce, connection, distraction. Yet it's become one of the most powerful forces reshaping how people think about religion. There was a time when ideas spread only as fast as a preacher could speak or a book could be printed. But digital communication broke that boundary. Now, a teenager in rural India, a middle-aged nurse in Brazil, and a student in Paris can all question their faith and find others doing the same instantly. Before the internet, doubt was lonely, isolated, often buried. Now, doubt travels at the speed of light. It has a voice, a face, a forum. It no longer needs permission to exist. This is where something subtle but revolutionary is happening. Religion has always relied on a kind of social insulation. It thrives when questions stay local, when answers come from authority, when criticism is taboo. But online, those walls break down quickly. In a 10-minute video, someone can summarize the history of a religion, compare it with others, highlight contradictions, trace its evolution, show its political uses, all while being polite, informed, and difficult to dismiss. That kind of clarity is disarming. It's not just about facts, though. It's about friction. People are seeing different views side by side. They can look at a religious claim and immediately compare it to science, history, psychology, and they don't need to ask anyone's permission to do it. That kind of access used to be rare. Now it's default. The more open the digital world becomes, the harder it is to maintain inherited beliefs without scrutiny. Algorithms, despite their flaws, often recommend skeptical content to those already on the edge. A single suggested video can start a domino effect. Someone types in a question about prayer, and they find a thread where people gently explain why they stopped. Someone Googles a verse and discovers it means something different than they were told. One moment of curiosity becomes a gateway. This is how digital atheism spreads. Not by force, but by erosion. Not by telling people what to think, but by giving them the tools to think differently. And the change isn't loud. It's not about protests or declarations, it's internal. Quietly, beliefs that once seemed immovable start to feel optional. Ideas that once explained the world start to look small in comparison to what we actually know now. There's a pattern that often goes unnoticed. When someone first questions their religion, they usually don't do it out of anger. It starts with confusion, a contradiction, a moment that doesn't make sense. And they want to make it make sense. So they search, they read, they compare, and for the first time they realize they're not alone in doubting. That realization is powerful because for centuries that kind of doubt was pushed down, treated as weakness or sin. But now it's just another thread online. Digital atheism, if you want to call it that, isn't an organized belief system. It doesn't have a church or a leader. It's decentralized, personal, often quiet, and yet it's growing fast. Why? Because it aligns with how people actually live now. Information is no longer a privilege. It's everywhere. And when people have access to information, they don't just learn new things, they begin to reevaluate the old ones. Take the story of someone who grew up in a devout household, taught from a young age that their religion was the only truth. They prayed daily, memorized sacred texts, avoided forbidden questions. Then one day, they stumbled onto a discussion board. Nothing aggressive, just people calmly pointing out inconsistencies. And that was the beginning, not of immediate disbelief, but of permission. Permission to think for themselves, permission to step outside the framework they were handed. It's not that the internet created new arguments against religion. Most of the core critiques are old: logical fallacies, contradictions, mythological borrowings, historical errors. But what's new is the reach, the context, the ability to present them clearly, calmly, and without being shut down. And here's where things get even more interesting. Religious institutions are responding, but often not well. They try to adapt with slick videos, modern branding, even TikTok preachers. But much of it feels like PR, not reflection. When someone sincerely questions doctrine, they don't want marketing, they want honesty. And many aren't getting it. They're told to have faith, to stop asking, that the problem is them, not the belief. But that approach rarely works anymore, because people have alternatives now. When an answer doesn't sit right, they Google it. When a story feels off, they look it up. When they're told not to question, they start questioning harder. And there's no longer a monopoly on answers. In fact, many of the strongest critiques come from former believers. People who know the texts, the traditions, the rituals. Not to mock them, but because they once followed them. Their perspective is sharp, because it's informed. And when they speak, it resonates. Digital atheism isn't about attacking anyone. It's about inviting honesty, about letting questions be asked and not punished, letting ideas stand or fall based on their own strength. And more often, people are finding that some beliefs fall faster than expected once they're examined closely. This process is happening across cultures. In places where religion is still dominant, you can still find young people quietly questioning, watching debates, reading comments, translating foreign content. They may not say it out loud, but the thinking has already changed. It shows up in statistics too. In country after country, belief in God is falling, especially among younger generations. Not always because of some dramatic crisis of faith, but because they simply don't find it useful, convincing, or necessary. The decline of belief doesn't mean the rise of despair. That's a myth. In fact, studies show that secular societies often report higher levels of well-being, education, gender equality, and trust in science. People find meaning in other places. Family, work, art, nature, relationships, learning. They don't need a divine command to care for others. They don't need fear of hell to make moral choices. They don't need ancient texts to understand the world around them. And more people are realizing that it's not just about removing belief. It's about replacing it with something better, something based on evidence, on compassion that doesn't require a reward, on wonder that doesn't need a supernatural story to feel profound. There's still a long way to go. In many parts of the world, questioning religion still carries risk. Families can disown you, communities can turn on you, governments can persecute you, but even there, cracks are forming. People are finding each other across borders, across languages, sharing stories, creating quiet networks of support, and over time those connections matter. Because once you see through a belief system that you were told was absolute, you can't unsee it. And the more people go through that process, the harder it is for old narratives to maintain their grip. That's the rise of digital atheism. It doesn't need a stage or a spotlight. It spreads through honest questions and honest answers, through quiet moments of clarity, through shared realizations. And it's changing the world, one click at a time. And that shift, isn't just happening in individuals, it's starting to reshape cultures. In places where religion once defined identity, nationally, politically, even racially, we're seeing more people draw that line differently. They're no longer willing to inherit beliefs just because their ancestors did. They're choosing based on coherence, not tradition. That choice has ripple effects. Education systems start adjusting. Laws slowly become more secular. Conversations about morality shift away from divine command and toward human well-being. It's not just personal anymore, it's structural. And with structure comes resistance. Of course it does. Religious leaders see what's happening. Some double down. They call the internet dangerous, blame moral decline, or try to regulate content. Others try to rebrand, to soften old dogma into something more palatable. But either way, the core problem remains. You can't undo access to information, and you can't unteach people to think. In a way, what we're seeing now is an evolutionary stress test. Religion has to adapt to a world where its claims are no longer protected from scrutiny, and some parts are failing that test faster than others. Literal interpretations of ancient texts have taken a big hit. The more people learn about history, language, and myth, the harder it is to treat these stories as fact. Noah's Ark, the creation of the universe in 6 days, talking snakes, once untouchable truths for some, now look more like folklore when placed next to modern knowledge. And it doesn't stop there. Claims about the afterlife, miracles, divine justice, all of them begin to wobble under the weight of closer inspection. But what's fascinating is how this unraveling doesn't feel hostile. Most people don't leave religion with a shout. They leave with a shrug. They realize the story doesn't make sense and quietly move on. This quiet exit is powerful because it's not about drama, it's about growth. And it creates space for something more grounded. For some, that space gets filled with science. For others, philosophy or creativity or activism. What unites them isn't what they left behind. It's what they choose to build next. And often, what they build is more inclusive, more adaptable, and more curious than what came before. That doesn't mean there's no cost. Leaving religion, even privately, can be painful. It can feel like losing a community, a language, even a part of yourself. But it can also feel like healing, like finding a voice you didn't know you had. And that's where digital spaces make a difference again. They provide something traditional communities often don't. Non-judgmental support. No expectation to convert or conform, just a place to ask hard questions and find others who ask them too. This is why digital atheism continues to spread, even in places that try to suppress it. Because at its core, it's not selling anything, it's not recruiting, it's just telling people, you're not alone in your doubt. And that message, simple as it is, has weight. Because when someone's worldview starts to shift, they're not looking for a new doctrine, they're looking for honesty. They want to know that it's okay to let go of beliefs that no longer hold up, that it doesn't make them bad or lost or broken. They just outgrew the story. And that's something many religious systems struggle to admit, that people can outgrow them without turning bitter or immoral. But the data tells a clear story. Losing belief doesn't mean losing empathy. If anything, it often deepens it. Because now, compassion isn't conditional. It's not reserved for members of a faith or people who live a certain way. It becomes about shared humanity, not shared theology. And for many, that feels like an upgrade. The more people step away from religious frameworks, the more they start to redefine what meaning looks like. It's not handed down anymore. It's created. Built from relationships, experiences, values, and goals. That kind of meaning is harder to package into a book, but it's often more resilient. Because it's chosen. And that's one of the quiet revolutions happening now. People are no longer afraid to choose their own path and to say out loud or just to themselves, this isn't working for me anymore. And when they say that, no one can put the genie back in the bottle. That quiet decision to let go of what no longer makes sense is one of the most personal yet most universal experiences in this shift. And it doesn't happen all at once. Most of the time, it's not one moment, but 1,000 small ones. A question that lingers, a contradiction that doesn't go away, a moment of honesty when someone admits, even just to themselves, that they no longer believe what they used to. The digital world accelerates this, not by pushing answers, but by revealing the questions others are asking too. It's in the comment sections, in long forum threads, in anonymous posts where people describe their journey, not to persuade, but just to tell the truth. And the more people see those stories, the more they realize belief isn't inevitable and unbelief isn't rare. This matters because visibility breaks isolation. And isolation is what kept so many trapped for so long. When you think you're the only one doubting, you assume the problem is you. But when you realize others have walked that path, it gives you the freedom to keep going. That freedom can be life-changing. It allows people to see religion as one perspective among many, not the unquestioned framework for life. It encourages critical thinking, and just as important, emotional honesty. People stop pretending, they stop performing belief. They start living more in line with what they actually think and feel. And that can be deeply relieving, but it can also be disorienting. Because religion often gave people a sense of purpose, a moral code, a community, letting go of it can feel like stepping into a void. That's why the journey doesn't end with disbelief. It continues into reconstruction. People ask, if not this, then what? What do I believe about meaning, ethics, purpose, death, love, the universe? And those are real questions, not easily answered by memes or headlines. But the internet again becomes a powerful resource, not because it hands people simple answers, but because it exposes them to the best thinking of thousands of years across cultures and disciplines. You can watch a lecture on moral philosophy, read a study on altruism, join a community that explores meaning without mysticism, listen to voices that explain how awe and wonder don't require a god, just a willingness to look closely at reality. These alternatives aren't perfect, but they're honest. They're open to revision. They don't punish you for asking the wrong question, and that alone makes them more appealing to many people who've felt burned by religion. That's the strange beauty of this moment in history. For the first time, people don't need permission to ask the hardest questions. They don't need a priest or pastor to mediate their search for truth. They can explore on their own terms. And increasingly they are, and here's something worth noting, especially for those who still see religion as necessary for morality, the evidence simply doesn't back that up. Secular individuals, people with no religious affiliation, aren't more selfish or more nihilistic. In many studies, they're actually more supportive of human rights, more tolerant of difference, more committed to scientific understanding, not because they've replaced religion with another dogma, but because they've grounded their values in human needs, not divine commands. And those values are evolving. As global awareness increases, so does the understanding that moral systems must work for everyone, not just the in-group. A God who tells you to love your neighbor, but only if they believe the right things, is no longer a compelling guide for many. Instead, people are turning to empathy, reason, and shared experience to guide their choices. They are looking at what actually reduces suffering, what actually increases well-being, and they're building ethics from the ground up, not the sky down. This is a huge shift, and it's happening quietly, every day, on screens across the world. But it doesn't mean that belief will vanish. Religion still plays a central role in many cultures. It still provides comfort to millions. But the monopoly is gone. The idea that belief is the default, that's what's dissolving. Now, belief is just one option. And it has to compete in the marketplace of ideas. It has to make sense in the light of everything else we now know. That's not an attack, that's just reality catching up. And in that reality, people are realizing that wonder doesn't need mythology, that kindness doesn't need commandments, that meaning doesn't require magic, and that death, while still difficult, doesn't have to be softened by stories we no longer believe. These realizations are often painful, but they're also liberating. They make room for a deeper, more honest kind of life. And they're not going away. The next generation is growing up with all of this within reach. Their first questions won't be met with silence. Their doubts won't be buried under shame. They'll be able to explore freely, thoughtfully, and with the knowledge that others have walked this path too. And they'll do it with tools we never had before. That's the rise of digital atheism. Not a movement with flags or slogans, but a shift in how people think, feel, and connect. A quiet revolution, built not on outrage but on understanding. Not on shouting people down, but on letting better ideas rise naturally. Because when better ideas are allowed to rise, they usually do. That rise, steady, quiet, sometimes invisible from the outside, is built on something older than any religion: curiosity. And curiosity, once it's awakened, is hard to shut down. It doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't care about tradition for its own sake. It just wants to know what's true and what's not. That instinct to question, to explore, to re-examine has always existed. But for most of history, it was confined, controlled, even punished. Today, it's unleashed. And the internet has been the single most powerful catalyst for that shift. Not because it promotes disbelief directly, but because it removes the barriers that once protected belief from examination. It creates space where people can think out loud without fear of being silenced, where questions are met with data, where inherited authority is replaced with critical engagement. And that's where belief struggles, because belief, especially the kind that claims divine origin, doesn't hold up well under open-ended scrutiny. It's built for obedience, not interrogation. It's built for repetition, not revision. But in digital spaces, repetition doesn't carry the same power anymore. When every sacred claim is searchable, when every holy text is annotated, when every doctrine can be cross-checked with history, psychology, and science, belief has to earn its place, not demand it. And many are finding that it doesn't. Or at least, not in the way they were taught to expect. They were told their religion was timeless, flawless, unchanging. But now they're seeing the cracks. Not because someone forced them to, but because they looked. And once you see how beliefs evolve, how they reflect the culture, politics, and power structures of their time, it becomes clear. They weren't revealed, they were constructed. That realization doesn't always lead to bitterness. Often it leads to a deeper appreciation for human creativity, for myth, for storytelling. But it also leads to a new kind of intellectual honesty, one that doesn't require pretending things are true when they're clearly not. And that honesty becomes contagious. People start asking sharper questions, not just about religion, but about everything, about institutions, about values, about how we know what we know. Digital atheism, in that sense, isn't just about God. It's about epistemology, about what counts as knowledge. And that's where it starts to influence more than just belief. It begins to change how people engage with politics, with media, with education. They start demanding evidence, consistency, transparency, and they become more comfortable saying, "I don't know," instead of clinging to a ready-made answer. That shift from certainty to inquiry is one of the most important consequences of the digital age. It's not just that people are leaving religion, it's that they're embracing a new kind of thinking, one that prizes open questions over closed systems. And once that way of thinking becomes normal, it's hard to go back. You see it in how young people respond to authority. Less reverence, more skepticism. Not out of cynicism, but out of experience. They've seen too many claims fall apart under pressure, too many stories that promised certainty and delivered control. And religion, for many, is just one more story that overpromised. That doesn't mean everyone becomes hostile to belief, far from it. In fact, many people who leave religion remain interested in spirituality, ritual, even some of the ethical frameworks they grew up with, but they engage with them as tools, not truths, as parts of a cultural heritage, not divine mandate. That distinction matters. It means they can take what works and leave what doesn't. They can appreciate a practice without pretending it's universal. They can respect tradition without being bound by it. And that flexibility, that freedom to mix, adapt, revise, is exactly what traditional religions struggle to accommodate, because many of them are built on absolutes, on the idea that there's one way, one truth, one path. But the digital world doesn't reward that kind of rigidity. It rewards nuance. It rewards honesty. It rewards people who are willing to say, maybe we got this wrong, and then try again. And that's what's redefining belief. Not just what people believe, but how they believe. They're moving from dogma to dialogue, from passive acceptance to active investigation, from inherited systems to self-constructed meaning. And that's not a loss, that's a gain, because it means people are building lives that reflect who they actually are, not just who they were told to be. They're aligning their values with reality, not revelation. And they're finding that the world doesn't become bleak or meaningless without religion. In fact, for many, it becomes more vivid, more precious, because this life, finite, fragile, unrepeatable, suddenly becomes more urgent, more worth protecting, more worth living fully. That's not a void, that's a foundation. And it's being built right now in countless conversations, comments, and quiet reflections across the digital world. Not all at once, not without setbacks, but steadily. Because the questions that drive people away from religion aren't going away. If anything, they're becoming harder to ignore. And the tools to explore those questions, to explore them well, are now in everyone's pocket. That access, the constant presence of knowledge, arguments, stories, doesn't just support change, it accelerates it. Because belief systems don't exist in isolation anymore. They're surrounded by context, by competing ideas, by searchable history. And when a system that claims to be perfect is placed beside the messy, complicated, often brutal reality of its past, people begin to ask, why did this belief system endorse slavery? Why did it resist science? Why did it marginalize certain groups? Why were so many of its timeless values clearly shaped by time and place? And they're not satisfied with evasions. They don't want metaphor when the text says something literal. They don't want reinterpretation when the original meaning is clear. They want accountability, and more they realize they don't need to make excuses for systems they didn't create. They can walk away, and in walking away, they're not losing a foundation, they're building a new one made of questions that are still open, one that isn't afraid of being wrong, one that welcomes revision. This isn't about arrogance. It's about intellectual humility, the kind that says, we don't know everything, but we're trying, and we're not going to pretend we know something just because it's written in an old book. That kind of humility is powerful, because it doesn't freeze people in place. It allows them to grow, to evolve with new information, to admit mistakes without losing their moral compass. And that's what belief systems have to compete with now. Not just new ideas, but a new mindset. A mindset that values clarity over comfort, reality over reassurance, honesty over hierarchy. And when people taste that, even briefly, it's hard to go back to dogma. It's hard to listen to someone say, this is the absolute truth, and not immediately think, says who? And when that instinct becomes second nature, not hostile, just skeptical, it changes everything. Because skepticism isn't a rejection of meaning. It's a demand that meaning makes sense. And in that demand, something beautiful happens. people begin to build meaning that actually fits their lives, that reflects their experiences, that holds up under pressure. They don't need to claim certainty. They don't need to be right forever. They just need ideas that are flexible, responsive, grounded. And they find those ideas in unexpected places. In philosophy, in science, in conversations, in art, in books that ask questions instead of answering them. This kind of worldview doesn't need to prove itself against divine threats or ancient punishments. It just needs to work in the real world. And for many, it does. They're not praying for answers, they're researching them. They're not waiting for a sign, they're learning to recognize patterns. They're not looking to the sky for justice, they're trying to create it on the ground. And that shift, from passive to active, from faith to engagement, is what digital atheism really represents. It's not about denying something, it's about affirming something better. Not better because it feels good, but better because it's honest, because it doesn't rely on suppressing questions. It grows by encouraging them, and the most encouraging thing of all is this: people are responding, not all at once, not everywhere, but steadily, globally, quietly. They're stepping out of inherited stories and starting to write their own. And in that writing, messy, unfinished, full of edits, they're finding a kind of meaning that's harder to sell, or ready to pay, but much harder to shake. A meaning built on reality, on connection, on curiosity, on change. Not controlled by doctrine, not enforced by guilt, not protected by taboo, just real, living thought, shared freely, built collaboratively, refined in public. That's not just a change in belief, that's a change in how we think. And once that change takes hold, there's no going back. And maybe that's the most important thing to understand about this shift. It's not just that fewer people believe. It's that more people are learning how to think in ways that make belief unnecessary. Because belief, in the religious sense, usually asks for something more than trust. It asks for surrender, for certainty without evidence, for obedience in the absence of understanding. But when people learn to think critically, not aggressively, just carefully, that kind of belief stops feeling noble. It starts feeling artificial. And that's not the result of bitterness, it's the result of clarity. Because once you get used to asking questions that don't have neat answers, you start to see the limits of systems that pretend they do. You see how they protect themselves with circular logic, how they define doubt as sin, disagreement as rebellion, and evidence as irrelevant when it's inconvenient. And you realize, maybe for the first time, that you don't have to play by those rules. You can walk away, not because you hate the system, but because you've outgrown it. And walking away doesn't leave a hole, not anymore. It opens a door, because once you're outside the framework, you start to see other frameworks, other ways of being, other ways of thinking about life and death, joy and suffering, purpose and love. Some people find that freedom overwhelming at first, but most find it liberating, because suddenly they're allowed to ask, what do I value really? What do I believe in, not because someone told me, but because I've thought it through? What kind of life makes sense if this is the only one I get? And those questions, while difficult, are honest. They don't hide behind mystery. They don't hand out easy answers, but they lead somewhere real. Some people end up in philosophy, others in activism, others in art or science or relationships. They find meaning where they used to look for rules. They find purpose where they used to look for commandments. And they start to understand morality doesn't come from obedience. It comes from empathy, from lived experience, from understanding what helps and what harms. And once you realize that, you stop needing a story about heaven and hell to make sense of what's good and what's not. You stop needing invisible threats to justify kindness. You stop needing surveillance to guide your conscience. You become responsible for your ethics. And that's not a burden, that's a freedom. It's the freedom to be good without needing to be watched, to care without needing to be promised a reward, to build without needing permission. And that kind of freedom, once people taste it, is hard to give up. That's what digital atheism offers, without ever having to say the name. A way of thinking that doesn't rely on belief, but on awareness. A way of living that doesn't depend on ancient stories, but on present reality. And because it's not a formal movement, it's not bound by spokespeople or creeds. It spreads in conversation, in curiosity, in contradiction, in silence, in clicks and pauses and long nights spent reading or watching or thinking. It spreads in moments that look ordinary but feel profound. When someone realizes they don't believe and nothing bad happens. When they stop praying and nothing collapses. When they ask a forbidden question and instead of fear, they feel relief. Those moments add up. They become a new kind of story, one that doesn't need miracles, one that doesn't revolve around guilt, one that doesn't ask for faith, only honesty. And honesty, once allowed to breathe, grows fast. It becomes part of how people talk, how they vote, how they raise their kids, how they respond to injustice, how they treat those who are different from them. Because without belief tying identity to salvation, there's no reason to divide the world into us and them. There's just us, figuring things out together with the tools we have in the time we're given. And that's enough. More than enough. And once that becomes clear, once people see that meaning, morality, and even transcendence are possible without belief, something else happens. They stop being afraid of doubt, not just intellectually, but emotionally. They stop feeling that doubt is a crack in the foundation. They start seeing it as a doorway, not a threat, but a signal that their understanding is growing. And when doubt is no longer something to suppress, belief systems lose their grip. Because for centuries, many religions taught that doubt was a weakness, that asking the wrong questions would lead you astray, that a strong believer didn't waver, didn't question, didn't think too hard. But now people are realizing, that's not strength, that's fragility. If your belief can't survive questions, it's not a belief, it's a script, a posture. And people are tired of postures. They want something deeper, something resilient, something that doesn't demand blind trust but earns thoughtful confidence. And they're not finding that in sermons. They're finding it in long-form conversations, in thoughtful videos, in carefully researched threads, in open-ended discussions where no one is trying to win, just to understand. And what they understand more and more is this: belief is not required. Not for meaning, not for morality, not for purpose, not even for wonder. That's one of the quiet revelations of this age, that awe is not exclusive to religion, that the feeling of standing before something vast and beautiful, whether it's a star system, a newborn child, or a mathematical truth, doesn't require a God. It just requires attention. And the more people pay attention, really pay attention, the less they feel the need for supernatural explanations, because the natural world is more than enough. Its complexity is staggering, its beauty is overwhelming, its mysteries are real, not invented, and the fact that we're conscious enough to explore it at all, that's not something that needs divine meaning to feel profound. It's profound already. And the more people explore it, through science, through philosophy, through experience, the more they realize that the stories they were told as children no longer measure up. Not because those stories were evil, but because they were limited, small. And the world, when examined honestly, is not small. It's messy, vast, complicated, sometimes brutal, sometimes breathtaking. And the frameworks that help us navigate it best are the ones that admit their own limits, not the ones that claim certainty at any cost. That's where the digital shift becomes philosophical. It's not just about what people do or don't believe, it's about how they orient themselves to uncertainty. Religious belief often treats uncertainty as a problem to be solved, something to eliminate. But critical thinking, secular thinking, treats uncertainty as a feature, something to work with, something to respect, and that shift in orientation changes how people live. They stop chasing absolute answers, they start seeking better questions, they stop clinging to identity through belief, they start grounding identity in values and action, in empathy and growth, and maybe most importantly, they become more comfortable saying, "I don't know," not as a failure, but as an invitation to keep learning, to stay open, to let ideas evolve instead of fossilizing them. And that kind of openness, that flexibility of mind, is spreading. It's not always visible. It doesn't show up in hashtags or headlines, but it's there, in the way people talk about death, about meaning, about what it means to live a good life. It's there in the fact that more and more people don't check a box for religion anymore, not because they've found something new, but because they no longer need to keep pretending, and when that pretending stops, the space that opens up can be filled with something better. And maybe that's the most important difference between belief as it was and the world as it's becoming. In the past, belief was something you were given, something you inherited, something you were expected to carry, whether or not it made sense. And for many, questioning it meant stepping into isolation, even danger. But now, that's changing. Quietly, permanently. Belief is no longer mandatory. It's optional, and in that shift, from obligation to choice, everything else begins to move. Because once belief becomes a choice, it has to justify itself. It has to make sense. It has to offer something better than silence when the questions come. And many people are finding it doesn't, not when compared with what they can find online in an afternoon, not when the contradictions are laid bare in a side-by-side reading, not when history, psychology, anthropology, and neuroscience give richer, more coherent explanations for what used to be called mystery. And so the process continues, not with trumpets or declarations, but with a quiet sigh of relief. One by one, people step away from belief, not because they were forced to, not because they were angry, but because it stopped working. Because the story didn't hold up, and in its place they found something more solid, not perfect, not complete, but honest, curious, self-correcting, a worldview that says, this is what we know so far, and it might change, and that's okay, because real strength doesn't come from certainty, it comes from the willingness to grow. And that's what we're seeing now, all across the world. People growing past the need for belief, not growing cold or hopeless, just growing up. And in that growth, they're building something new, a way of living that doesn't rely on ancient answers, a way of relating to others that isn't filtered through judgment, a way of seeing the universe that doesn't shrink it down to a test. They're finding meaning in meaning itself, value in experience, joy in discovery and purpose. Not in obedience, but in contribution. They're asking better questions and learning how to live inside those questions, and they're doing it together. In forums, in video essays, in conversations and DMs and long threads and quiet personal notes. This isn't a movement in the traditional sense. It doesn't have a name or a leader or a flag. It's not a religion, and it never will be. It's a shift, one person at a time, stepping away from the need to be told what's true and starting instead to figure it out. That's the rise of digital atheism, not a wave of destruction, but a quiet clearing of space for better ideas to grow and for people, maybe for the first time, to be honest with themselves and free